It's Kenny! When you look at the video game industry today, you would never think that at one time in history, it almost died. As of currently, the industry is booming, and you can virtually see video games being played and sold everywhere. I'll be honest, it's never been a better time to be a gamer. But would you viewers believe me if I told you that once upon a time in video game history, gaming wasn't considered a hobby? It's true. Back during the second generation of video games, a lot of people, including a good percentage of gamers, considered gaming more along the lines of a fad, something to have its 15 minutes of fame and then be quietly forgotten. It didn't help matters when the industry itself was practically giving the public a reason to have that opinion. But you guys are probably wondering, where does E.T. fit into all this? Well, allow yours truly to explain. This is the tale of the video game industry crash and how one game became the face of it all. In the few years prior to the crash, video games were experiencing what is commonly referred to as the Golden Era. The Golden Era was a time when the video game industry was worth millions of dollars. A lot of classic games such as Donkey Kong and Space Invaders came out of that era too. The Golden Era was also a time when the Atari 2600, the Intellivision, and the ColecoVision were enjoying a successful run. On a minor note, arcades were hitting it big during the Golden Era as well. However, there is a dark side to progress. One of the major issues with the industry back then was the lack of licensing. In other words, anybody, or any company in most cases, could make a game and sell it on the market. Today, this would never happen. Not without litigation anyway, but back then, totally legal. Now, I know that sounds like a good idea, on paper, but in practice it was a mess. The market quickly got flooded with games, and because the internet was practically non-existent back then, it was really hard to tell which games were good and which were bad. In addition to there being just too many games on the market, there was also too many consoles. You had the main three, of course, but there were other contenders trying to sell their merchandise as well. Again, the general public just didn't know where to look. Too many choices, and not enough info to entice potential buyers. All of this spelled bad news for the industry. They had no control, and because of that, they ended up losing millions of dollars. So because they had virtually no authority in the market, coupled with crippling money loss, many decided to simply pull out or fold entirely. This was the reason the crash happened. But again, how did E.T. fit into this problem? Well, the short answer is, it kind of didn't. Or at least, it didn't play as big of a role as it was made out to have been. Let me show you. The problem with E.T. began with its development. Firstly, the devs were given a deadline, and they only had 6 weeks to make the game. An average game back then took roughly around 3 to 4 months to complete. E.T. didn't have that luxury, and therein lies its first issue. It was rushed. Another problem that was going on in development was the lack of people working on the game. Going back to how an average game was made back then, a dev team usually either consisted of no less than 4 or no more than 6 people working on a title. E.T. only had 2 guys. That was just simply not enough devs to be working on a game. Finally, there was the lovely problem with the business aspect of E.T.'s development. You see, Atari was the biggest name in video games during the second generation, and the suits whom were the owners of Atari thought that they could pretty much sell anything and people would buy it. They had this grandiose idea that people would actually buy a 2600 just to play E.T. So they ordered an estimated 5 million copies to be manufactured. Once more, during that time, only about 250 to around 300,000 copies were manufactured for an average game. We're talking about hundreds of percentages more than what was usually made. Atari really thought that E.T. was going to help move more of their merchandise, but it didn't. In fact, it did the opposite. Word spread fast that the game was terrible, and thus E.T. became a critical as well as a financial blunder. Many of the copies that were sold ended up being returned. This was really bad because Atari was now sitting on a pile of games that they couldn't even give away. So one dark night, the shareholders and the CEO of Atari decided to take all of their unsold E.T. games, along with some other excess stuff that they couldn't sell, and dump it all in a landfill in New Mexico. And I can't say I blame them for doing that. If I were one of the people responsible for this game's existence, I would want it to be erased from history too. And E.T. is a very bad game. I know it doesn't look like much, but try to view it from the perspective of a gamer in 1983. Graphically, it looks awful, especially if you compare it to better titles such as Yar's Revenge or Defender. There's also this really annoying glitch in the game where E.T. can get stuck on the edge of a pit, and no matter what you do, he'll always manage to fall back in. But what really makes E.T. bad is its gameplay. This title is completely devoid of any fun. What you do throughout the entire game is fall in holes, pick up random items, avoid two bad guys, and rinse repeat until you have enough random items to phone home and get picked up. This is E.T.'s hugest issue. It just simply isn't fun to play. And isn't that one of, if not the most important reason to even play a game? Because you want to have fun? You'd be better off doing literally anything other than playing this title. It'd be a heck of a lot more entertaining, that's for sure. So we've gone over why E.T. for the 2600 was so bad, but why did it end up becoming the image of the Crash itself? After all, E.T. was just one bad game in a figurative ocean of bad games. Well, the reason behind E.T. becoming the face of the Crash was because of journalism. As it is today, back then, journalism was quite sensationalist. Journalists just assumed that people wouldn't want to read about the technical aspects of why the industry was in a downward spiral, so they made E.T. look far worse than it really was. I gotta say that that's kinda unfair. I mean, the game is bad, at least as bad as a second-gen game can be, and it was good that it got bashed for that, but it wasn't the sole cause of why the industry ended up the way it did back in 1983 and 1984. As I mentioned earlier, the industry crashed because there were no regulations in the market, and that led to an overabundance of both hardware and software. E.T. was merely a small, very fractional part of what was an even bigger problem. Therefore, the game shouldn't be blamed, at least not fully, for the industry's crash. As for this final score of this title, I'm gonna give it a 1 out of 10. It's unplayable. I mean, it's fine to own a copy as like a piece of video game history, but as for actually playing it, woe be unto all those who do. Well everyone, that's all I have to say about E.T. and its relationship to the infamous video game crash. I hope it was informative, and I can't wait to review more for you guys.
Well, guess what? There was another E.T. game that came out. And this one might even be worse. E.T. Interplanetary Missions was released on PlayStation 1 in December 30th of 2002. The developer is Santa Cruz Games. The publisher was New Kid Co., basically Ubisoft. Now, when you first start the game, you're treated with a nice cutscene, and I was actually thinking, whoa, this looks pretty good. Then you get into the gameplay. Now this is where the game completely falls apart. It is a boring, sloppy mess. The graphics look ugly, E.T. looks like a shriveled up ball sack, You have these weirdly shaped monsters chasing you to try to kill you. I don't know why you're even on this planet. You're collecting ingredients for some reason. You have superpowers like telekinesis to grab items that are far away, but grabbing them and moving them around is a mess. It's horrible controls. And there's other times where ET won't even use his telekinesis powers. He'll just use his hands to lift something and put it down on something, and then a door will open and be like, sweet, I get to go do the exact same thing now in this area. The animations are horrible to watch. They're hilarious. Like, look what happens when ET is chased by some monster. He just goes, ah! Like, running in this is just hilarious. There is one thing in this game that is decent, and it's the music. It actually sounds pretty good. I don't know who came up with the idea where they're like, hey, here's a good idea. Remember that game E.T. that was so totally awesome in the 80s? Let's remake it now. Yeah, that's going to make us a lot of money. Just think of the money you wasted trying to acquire a license to a game nobody wants to play. You could have came up with your own adventure, your own story, your own IP. But instead, you just bought something for a cash grab, and I'm more than sure this game bombed. Wow. Look how depressed I am because I have to play this game. Aw, poor Dylan. So if I had to rate this, I'm going to match Kenny's rating. I'm going to give it a 1. You know, all the E.T. games will probably get 1s forever and ever. I can't imagine them making a new one, but if they did, it gets a 1. This gets a 1. The old one gets a 1. Thank you for watching. It's Kenny. And if you want to see more from Kenny, all you have to do is hit one of these 2 boxes. That's it. And you can watch all the Kenny you'd like.